Welcome to Tales Told When the Windows Rattle. I'm Tim Prossel. You know, whenever I go to an old theater, whether it's a live performance theater or a movie theater, if it looks to be more than about 50 years old, I will go up to one of the employees and say, "So tell me, do you have any ghosts in the theater?" Inevitably, they do. And I get rewarded with a very interesting story. So that's my advice to you. If you're ever in an old theater, ask about the ghosts, because you're probably going to hear a pretty cool story. Here's a story about a haunted theater. It's one of my Vera Vance-like ghostly mysteries. In fact, it's the second investigation held by my great-grand-aunt, Ludmila Prosilova, though it's 1900 and she's going by the name of Lucille Parcell, and her not quite yet very good friend, Vera Vance-like. The title is The Ghost of Banquo's Ghost. Vera Vance-like's expose on the seance held at the Morley Mansion appeared in newspapers across the U.S. and into Canada. I was relieved that the article left me unnamed, since it laid bare my fraudulence as a spiritualist medium at that same seance. I very much hoped I would likewise remain anonymous in Vera's subsequent book, exposing the tricks of my trade. Eager to atone for that life of pretense, I had divulged many secrets to her for the book. During the interviews, however, Vera invited me along on an investigation of a ghost purported to be haunting a church, a ghost that proved to be entirely real. After the interviews regarding my counterfeit psychic powers and the adventure with the genuine ghost, Vera and I promised we would keep in touch via letters. She left Boston to return to New York City, and I went to my hometown of Chicago. As so often happens, no letters were sent either way. By August of 1900, I had secured a position on the sales floor of Mandel Brothers, the popular department store on State Street. It had become my routine to eat my lunch in a back room of this large establishment. One day, a woman who I recognized as one of the manager's wives joined me there. She had come to while away a bit of time with a newspaper. The woman had not introduced herself, and I was keeping quiet, as a humble sales clerk ought. "It's a stunt," the manager's wife snorted, giving the newspaper a good shake. I had just taken a bite of my apple and could not reply. Instead, I angled my head and looked inquisitive, feeling something like a puppy. She pointed to the headline, "Spectre creates spectacle at Scepter." Still chewing, I knit my eyebrows and leaned forward. The fine print was too far away to read. She must have understood. "Oh, there's supposed to be a ghost tossing things around at the Scepter Theater. Ask me, it's a stunt to sell tickets. Shakespeare, after all. The play's not the thing folks will go see. They'll go to catch sight of that ghost." "Shakespeare?" I said after swallowing. I once heard that Shakespeare's works weren't written by the person who we typically say... "All I know about Shakespeare," the woman interrupted, "is men dress up like women and women like men. Maybe some consider that fine art, but give me an old-fashioned minstrel show, if you please." "What does it say about the ghost?" I asked. My views of ghosts had changed considerably during the investigation in Boston. "They claim it dropped a crossbar or whatever they use to hang backdrops, almost crushed an actor." She flung the newspaper to the table and exited the room. "Ghosts in a Shakespeare play now," the woman muttered on her way out. I examined the article quickly. The very last line read, "A lady investigator of similar hauntings has been summoned from New York." Though no specific lady was mentioned, I am fairly certain that I spoke the three segments of her name out loud. Vera Van-Slyke. After work, I found that the lake breeze was cool enough to make a late summer stroll from downtown to the Scepter Theater an inviting one. Ticket prices there were beyond my current salary, but I knew the location. I found one of the stage doors unlocked. Technicians, or possibly actors in street dress, paid little attention to me as I walked amid curtains and ropes, hoping to find the audience seating area. Instead, I wandered under the glaring lights of stage left. Shading my eyes, I scanned the dark rows upon rows of seating. "Well, it's high time you arrived." This came echoing from above. I recognized the voice and was excited to spot Vera's tall figure waving at me from the first balcony. She stood beside someone, so I raised my palm to her and began to wind my way down from the stage, along the aisle, and up the stairs. Once I had arrived, Vera made the gentleman wait while we embraced. "Oh, I think you're going to enjoy this one," she said with a grin. "Apparently there have been some very odd goings-on here, as Mr. Haddock has been telling me just now." "A pleasure to meet you," he said, half bowing to me, "but my name is Chester Paddock, not Haddock." "Terribly sorry," said Vera quickly. "I'm practicing a new system to remember names, you see. As the play's director, you act much like the captain of a ship at sea, searching for fish, and perhaps finding haddock, which of course rhymes with paddock. I haven't quite mastered the system yet." We all chuckled courteously. "Do go on with what you were saying, Mr. Paddock," I said. "I'm certain Vera will fill me in afterward." I admit that I hadn't known what to expect of a theatrical director, but Mr. Chester Paddock was unexpectedly ordinary. His hair was sparse, and he held a pair of spectacles in his hand. His suit was a solid gray, the collar slightly crooked. Perhaps its most distinctive feature was the trace of a drawl, one suggestive of a childhood spent close to the Mason-Dixon line. "Well, I was just telling Miss Van Slyck that this production was intended to feature the final performance of the great Luther Arnold Weber. I believe this would have been his 5th final performance, but as it turns out, he died of heart trouble while we were still in rehearsal. I figure if anyone were haunting the place, it would be him." "Would he have had a particular reason to return here?" I asked. I shrunk back, fearing that I had entered the discussion too quickly. Neither Vera nor Mr. Paddock seemed irked. "Mr. Paddock," said Vera with a nod to the director, "was explaining that Luther Arnold Weber took his acting very seriously. If he agreed to a role, he veritably became that character, insisting the audience deserves no less." "And he expected no less from everyone else in the cast and crew," added Mr. Paddock. "He was not an easy man to get along with, but one had to admire his dedication. That sense of commitment is why I think he's come back from the grave." Vera slowly shook her head. "The manifestations, however, suggest otherwise." I opened my mouth to speak, but caught myself. Vera must have noticed this. She explained, "We appear to be dealing with what Catherine Crowe describes as a poltergeist, a term she takes from the Germans. These are not spirits clinging to the physical realm. Instead, a poltergeist is more like a phantom ball of mischief that bounces in all directions. It knocks things over, shatters bottles, hurls vases, and generally makes a nuisance of itself." "This production has seen a lot of such activity," Mr. Paddock added. I could not hold back. "But this activity hadn't begun until after the death of your lead actor, correct?" Mr. Paddock nodded and shrugged. "In fact, it almost killed his replacement. One of the battens, a batten is a heavy pipe that holds up a backdrop. One of these fell just as Luther's replacement was walking beneath it. Never heard of such a thing." Vera received permission to speak with the actor who was to step into the role left open by Mr. Weber's demise. On our way to the makeup room, I told her about my current position as sales clerk, and she informed me that her book about the deceptions of spiritualism was in its final stages. It felt as if no time at all had passed. However, this mood was derailed the moment she asked what might have seemed like a very simple question. "Why did you not introduce yourself to Mr. Paddock?" she asked me. "Oh," I replied, "I assumed you had told him who I was as I was coming to join you." "I see, my dear, I see." I halted us both. With some hesitation, she pivoted toward me. I required a moment. At last, I said, "Why hadn't you written to let me know you were coming to Chicago?" She jerked her head away and avoided eye contact. "Well, it all worked out, didn't it? Here you are." I sighed deeply. "You don't remember my name, do you?" She pressed her lips tightly together before hypothesizing aloud. "I remember the initial G. Lucille Parcell." "There's no G at all, is there now?" Ah, but you went by another name when conducting seances, did you not? She bit her lip. I hissed, Ludmila Prasilova. Again, not a G to be found anywhere. I'm not very strong with names, she confessed quietly, her head slowly listing to the starboard. At times I think I would be wise to hire a personal assistant. Are you happy as a sales clerk? I refused to answer, and instead grabbed her by the elbow to resume our walk. Once we had located the makeup room, we found the actor who had narrowly avoided being crushed. His name was Reginald Caber, and he came closer to my mental picture of a theatrical professional. His hair was blonde and longish, and his chin was strong and cleft. A script sat between him and a long line of mirrors. These mirrors, I noted, were lit with electrical bulbs rather than gas flames. Curiously, rather than reposition his chair, Mr. Caber spoke to our reflections in the mirror. This inspired us to do the same in return. After we had exchanged introductions, Vera began the interview. I've been developing a theory that a concentration of the emotion guilt weakens the borders between the physical and spirit realms. Can you think of anyone involved with the show who suffers from a guilty conscience? Mr. Caber laughed with startling volume. Why, it's the Scottish play, isn't it? It drips with guilt, to the point of hallucination. Macbeth, who murders King Duncan, claims to see a floating dagger. Lady Macbeth, who shames her husband into committing the deed, thinks she cannot wash the blood from her hands. The play is a deep study of guilt. Lucille, what do you think? Vera asked. Is it possible, Lucille, that stage-acted guilt could work in the same supernatural manner as true guilt? Do you suppose, Lucille? I'm not certain, Vera, I spat back, still warm from our skirmish over her forgetting my name. Perhaps, Vera, a play about guilt reminds those involved of their own reasons for feeling that emotion, Vera. She reacted to my taunts by slumping her shoulders. She turned to Mr. Caber's reflection and said, I know others working on the play have witnessed objects flying and falling. However, have any of these others been endangered by the phenomenon? If they have, I am unaware of it. I heard myself mutter, You know, Sherlock Holmes never forgets Dr. Watson's name. Vera turned slowly to me. I don't know who Sherlock Holmes is, my dear. Only then did I realize that Vera's forgetting my name was not due to any ill will. She simply had certain limitations along with her remarkable attributes. With some poetic justice, I regretted venting my spite. I felt, in a word, guilty. Vera turned back to Mr. Caber's image in the mirror. Do you think the falling backdrop support was actually intended to hit you? If I didn't believe it was a complete coincidence, I would now be speaking to a police detective rather than to yourself. Those battens are heavy enough to kill. There's some talk that it's the ghost of Luther Arnold Weber, that he's angry about my taking his role. But I knew Luther. He was a consummate thespian. The overall production is what mattered to him, and he's hardly in a position now to do a better job than me at playing the lead. Has anyone claimed to have heard any voices? Asked Vera. Of course, I mean disembodied voices. I don't recall anyone mentioning spirit voices. This brings us back to the poltergeist theory. Thank you so much, sir. I do sincerely wish that should any bones be injured, it is your leg and not your spine. Mr. Caber shifted from Vera's reflection to peer at mine as if seeking clarification on her last statement. She means to say break a leg in the theatrical sense, I assured him. He nodded and rose from his chair to signal farewell. He then returned to studying his lines. Vera and I were almost out the door when she turned back. One last question, sir, a very informal one. Could you recommend a local establishment where I might purchase some beer? I remembered that during our previous investigation, Vera had shown a taste for beer. In fact, I had sampled my first bottle of it with her. Still looking at us by way of the mirror, Mr. Caber replied, "I'm most sorry, but I am not a drinking man. I know there are taverns in the neighborhood, but I would not be able to tell you which one is preferable over the other." Exactly then, one of the electrical bulbs burst loudly. Its glass was spewed across the table and floor. I grabbed Vera's arm. Another bulb popped, and Mr. Caber almost fell backward in his chair. As if a giant fist holding a giant hammer were sweeping across the room, the line of remaining bulbs exploded in rapid succession. The room plunged into darkness, though the hall light remained steady. "Are you still with us, sir?" Vera shouted. "Speak to me, Mr. Carter." I did not correct Vera, but instead waited for a reply from the darkness. The dashing actor's image slowly came into view as he walked toward us. Rather than appearing heroic, though, he was quivering. The electric lights bursting stirred a good deal of hubbub. Once it settled, Vera asked Mr. Paddock if he knew of some place to buy beer. He mentioned the Foiled Gelding, a nearby public house where many of the theatrical personnel ate and drank. He assured us that 2 unaccompanied women would be treated respectfully there. Once arrived at this pub, we selected a nook away from the boisterous activity. Vera traced the grain of the dark-stained table with her finger. She kept glancing up at me as if reluctant to speak her mind. "What is it?" I inquired, reaching my hand to her arm. "I should have written," she lamented. "It's all this travel, people flitting in and out of my life. At times I consider settling down and forming more lasting friendships, but I know that a highly ritualized life would put me into a stupor. Which should I choose, a stupor or chaos? It's why I think a personal assistant might be of value. Tell me, are you happy in your current position?" I reflected before saying, "Things could be worse." I was so intent on leaving the spiritualism racket behind that I was ready to go to work in the stockyards. It was an old friend who helped me find less bloody work. I should have written to you as well. I am not lying when I say I had a hunch we would meet here. I did remember that you live in Chicago. Maybe the hunch sprang from that." We smiled. I was not fully prepared for the sudden shift in topics, though. "That actor has a problem with alcohol. He drinks more brutal stuff than beer, I tell you." "Oh, Reginald Caber? But didn't he claim he isn't a drinker at all? Could you smell it on his breath?" "I can believe an actor might avoid drink altogether. I barely believe it. Nonetheless, one who works around other actors, yet who cannot even name a local drinking establishment, must surely be lying. Let me remind you how easily that other fellow, that drab director, Mr. Paddock," I clarified, "how easily he recommended this pub. Now let's tip a paint can and see what picture takes shape, shall we?" Vera's interesting expressions gave some glimmer of the operations of her mental facilities. I noticed next that when forming a theory, she had no problem remembering names. "Let's say we are dealing with the spirit of the late Luther Arnold Webber, the consummate thespian, Mr. Caber called him." Vera placed 2 fingers against the side of her jaw. "What if our ghost knew of his replacement's drinking, knew that it threatened the production? Could Webber be trying to scare him off?" I began to see the picture forming in the spilled paint. I suggested, "By posing as a poltergeist?" "He is an actor, after all," Vera said. "His manifestations seem to be closing in on Mr. Caber. We witnessed as much. And even if the guilt evoked by the play cannot explain how Webber is able to reach across from the spirit realm, it might be that Mr. Caber's secret drinking causes him terrible shame." "Very astute. I hadn't considered that. But where does this leave us?" "Perhaps Mr. Caber needs careful watching," I suggested. Vera was too meditative to notice that our food and beverages were now being set before us. She concluded, "Watching, I think, is key. This drama needs more watching." After our meal, we returned to the theater. As the production was behind schedule due to the death of its lead actor, additional rehearsals were being held each evening. Mr. Paddock had invited Vera to attend her choice of rehearsals in the hope that she might observe something useful. Unfortunately, we promptly learned that this evening's rehearsal was delayed due to trouble with a witch's cauldron. Vera used the time to hunt down the production's leading lady. "If she plays Mr. Keba's wife," Vera explained, "it's possible she'll have an insight into his offstage life." The playbill listed the actress playing Lady Macbeth as Josephine LaFrance. Despite the Gallic cast of her name, the woman's offstage accent attested to her being from someplace closer than even Quebec. We found her in a dressing room. Wearing a wig that cascaded with russet waves, Miss LaFrance stood on a stool while her lavish costume was being refitted to better accommodate her grand figure. Without reserve, Vera marched toward the actress and offered her hand. "Mrs. Macbeth," she jested, "my name is Vera Van Slyke. I've been asked to eliminate whatever has been haunting this show, and I'm being ably assisted by this pretty Miss Lucille. Stopping at the door, I chuckled. "Lucille Parcell." "No need to be nervous, Lucy," said the actress. "Come on in. Don't let the dress fool you. I only put on airs to pay my rent. Vera, is it? So you're here to evict our ghost, eh?" After shaking hands with Miss LaFrance, Vera turned to the woman doing the tailoring. Holding pins in her mouth, she was a petite woman with a dark complexion and deftly controlled hair. Vera also offered her hand to this seamstress, who had to bunch the folds of the dress into one hand before returning the salutation. "That's Mary, my dresser," noted Miss LaFrance before declaring, "but so's we're clear, I'm the very first to have had a brush with that ghost." Vera considered the actress a moment. "Now, I've heard that accent before, on some of the more colorful streets of New York City, if I'm not mistaken." "Are you from New York, too?" she shouted. "Yeah, it takes a local ear to catch my accent." The dresser and I shared a look of curbed amusement. Vera replied, "I grew up in a small town quite a way up the Hudson, but I moved to Manhattan as soon as I was able." Miss LaFrance grinned slightly. "Yeah, Manhattan's nice. But you asked about my brush with the ghost. It was when I'm telling Macbeth how to kill the king, if memory serves." Vera's eyebrows rose. "So the actor now playing Macbeth was near you, correct?" She turned to wink at me. "Yeah, Reggie was there. But I'm the very first to have spotted the bottle come rolling on stage. I went ahead reciting my lines, figuring one of the stagehands knocked it off the props table." "What kind of bottle was it?" Vera inquired. "Oh, the old sort, clay, I think. A porter or someone carries it in a later scene. But I'm reciting my lines when in come this bottle. It rolls, it stops. It rolls, it stops, and rolls and stops, like some baby playing with a ball." "Intriguing," Vera stated. "And then?" Well, once the bottle had stopped that third time, it stopped dead. Absolutely dead." After a hesitation, Vera looked back at me and shrugged. This was apparently the extent of the manifestation. Removing the pins from her mouth, Mary added, "We've had more scary things happen, too. Other props flung and dashed on stage. Strangeness off stage, too." "I suppose that's true, Mary," said the actress, who then checked her seams. "But I'm the very first to have had a brush with the ghost." After a quick smirk, Mary licked her thumb and ran it along the seam. She next patted Miss LaFrance's back, and the actress stepped down from the stool. Vera stated, "Thank you kindly for your help. It's always useful to hear about the earliest manifestation, from the very first witness. Mary, may I now speak with you about those later manifestations?" She turned to Miss LaFrance. "We can move if you'd like a private spot to concentrate on your lines." After glancing between Vera and Mary, the actress replied, "Nah, we'll be starting soon. The cast needs me to give 'em a stimulating speech beforehand." She straightened her costume, bid Vera and me luck with the investigation, and exited. The rest of us found seats. Vera began her interview, and I strained to detect what she might be garnering from Mary's account of objects tipping, skidding, and crashing inexplicably. At one point, Mary interrupted to say, "I hear they're calling places. If you ladies want to watch the rehearsal, you best be going. I do hope that I've helped a little, though."
"You've helped very much, my dear." Vera again shook the woman's hand. "Putting what you've told me in order and placing it after that minor event Miss LaFrance described, I am now of a mind that our ghost is in fact improving at being a poltergeist."
"Do you mean... What do you mean?" I stuttered. Mary explained it. "You mean he's rehearsing?" Vera nodded and replied,
"Well phrased."
Finding our way back to the seating area, Vera and I treated ourselves to the front row. There was something about Vera's demeanor, perhaps a leisurely lean, that suggested her interview with Mary and Miss LaFrance had settled the mystery she had been hired to solve. Even so, her silence suggested she was waiting for one concluding piece of evidence. Settling myself in my seat, I asked, "Do you attend many theatrical productions?"
"Well, you recall that I am from New York City, my dear," she said, mimicking a snobbish tone. "As such, I am hardly convinced that I'm attending a theatrical production right now."
Our giggles earned us a stern expression from Mr. Paddock. I had never seen a production of Macbeth previously. Its mixture of witchcraft and politics was very much at odds with the melodramas and musical reviews I could afford. Miss LaFrance's earlier dialect was expertly disguised, and in fact, she was a truly riveting actress. More germane to the haunting, though, I began to comprehend why Mr. Caber described the play as a deep study of guilt. It was the third act. A feast was being held for Banquo, though Macbeth had had that guest of honor murdered. Whispering, Vera asked if I had spotted any evidence of Mr. Caber furtively imbibing. I had not. I was leaning over to her ear, intending to suggest that we move to positions backstage. Instead, I yelped loudly, much to Vera's anguish. One of the pewter dinner plates and its matching goblet had risen from a table. They were then hovering about 2 feet in the air. None of the actors were positioned to see it. However, once I managed to raise a trembling finger to point, Vera saw the impossibility that I saw. She immediately stood, shouting, "I advise the actors to quickly depart." But the plate and goblet were now flying in different directions. As had happened with the electrical light bulbs, the next dinner setting, and the next, went hurtling across the stage. The actors scurried to crouch behind chairs or shields or whatever else the props and set afforded. Only Mr. Caber remained standing. He looked around as if dazed. And then he wiggled. He wiggled as if performing a comic rendition of a South American dance. At last he grabbed around behind himself. It was too late, though, for a silver flask was slowly levitating above him, a flask that apparently had been hidden in the back of his costume. It ascended of its own accord to a position between its owner and the audience seats. Mr. Paddock had now rushed up onto the stage. He froze there. Along with all the other witnesses, he fell under the immobilizing spell of the floating flask. Our bewitchment crumbled, though, because of something incongruous. It was Mr. Caber's loud laugh, the same guffaw we had heard in the makeup room. It was not one of those laughs that curiously burst from someone alarmed, however. It was a drunken laugh.
"Is this a flagon I see before me?"
he jested. He then jumped to snatch the flask, but the invisible agent yanked it away from him. I turned to Vera. Her eyes were fixed on the scene, but a twist in her lips and a sigh told me that she was sorry her theory had been proven correct. As it turned out, she had a final surprise awaiting her. "I have a strong notion," she announced loudly, "that what I had taken to be a poltergeist is in fact the spirit of Luther Arnold Weber.
He's come to ensure a successful production of his last scheduled play by showing that your new lead actor might not be in the best condition to remember his lines."
At that very point the flask dropped to the floor with a resounding clang. "Nonsense!" shouted Reginald Caber, as much to the entire company as to Vera. He ran to retrieve the fallen flask. "This is exactly what I need to carry me through this performance. Have I slurred? Have I missed my mark? Chester, tell me if I've in any way hurt the... Chester, what are you staring at?" Mr. Paddock slowly took the flask from Mr. Caber. The director was scrutinizing the polished canteen while chewing on the inside of his cheek. He said, "Miss Van Slyke, you say Luther is back among us?"
"That is my belief," she replied.
"And he could make things float and move without wires?"
"He appears to have perfected that talent now."
"Luther," Mr. Paddock said decisively, though he said it into the air, "you've passed the audition. I'm recasting you in the role of Banquo's ghost. We'll also need you to work the dagger at the start of Act 2. The theater and everyone within it were starkly silent. Even Vera was dumbstruck. "Granted, it's not the lead," the director continued, "but you were always far more concerned with the production overall than your place in it. Rest assured, Luther, you'll get top billing. This will again be your final performance." "He'll get top billing? A dead man?" Mr. Caber scolded, as much as inquired. He reached out for his flask. Mr. Paddock pulled it back. "We'll assign a guard to Reginald here. We'll use Malcolm's entire army, if need be, to prevent him from drinking."
Mr. Caber continued to hold his hand out for the flask, looking something like Romeo expressing his longing for Juliet on her balcony. Suddenly the actor's hand drooped. Next his posture altogether drooped too. Vera crossed her arms. She gave me the look of someone who had relinquished any control over her horse now that it had caught scent of the barn. "Luther!" shouted Mr. Paddock. "Luther, give us a sign if you accept the role. You know you'll pack the house. It'll be a finale unprecedented in the history of drama." It seems that even an actor who cared more about the audience than his own reviews could not dismiss such an accolade. One of the tossed plates rose from the floor, and then another plate, and then a goblet. The three items hovered only a moment before the incorporeal Luther Arnold Weber began to juggle them. In fact, the seasoned showman juggled them admirably. The company of actors, still looking rather stunned, slowly began to applaud. Naturally, this production of the play was controversial from opening night through the end of its run. Mr. Paddock had informed the press that the late Luther Arnold Weber would be featured in the role of Banquo's ghost, and no one else in the show denied this. Nonetheless, critics were divided. Some found the idea delightfully true to the spirit of Shakespeare's tale, while others decried it as preposterous. One local magician claimed he would debunk the production's astounding effects by reproducing them in his own act. He never did. After the production had completed its schedule, no poltergeist activity was reported to linger at the Scepter Theater. Needless to say, other ghosts have since been spotted or heard or felt. It is a theater, after all. Vera's involvement with the Scepter, however, ended after that evening she had revealed the ghost's identity and the motives behind the haunting. She decided to remain a while in Chicago, a city she said held certain charms. One evening we shared another dinner at the Foiled Gelding. "Won't you come back with me to New York?"
she asked as we were finishing our beers.
"You would make a fine assistant, and I can promise you far grander adventures than one finds even in retail sales."
"Tempting," I replied. "However, my years as a medium still clamor in my head. I yearn for a break from all types of spirits, phony, authentic, and theatrical. It's nice to have time to catch up on my reading. Still, Who knows what the future might present? I am only 18 years old, you know.
Didn't you say you was 17?
That was in Boston last year.
Ah.
Vera's brown eyes drifted to her napkin.
Try as I might, I have no hunches that we'll ever get together again.
Perhaps that's for the best. Didn't Macbeth lose his head for acting on a hunch, albeit a very strong hunch? My attempt at wit seemed lost on Vera. She looked at me with a blinking squint. I clarified. Macbeth was the character in the play Macbeth.
Oh, yes, dear, I know that. Sometimes I remember names.
With a thoughtful tilt to her head, Vera then gave me a very direct look. Her silence suggested that perhaps she was experiencing a hunch at that very moment. She reached out and touched my arm.
Yes, sometimes I remember names. Dr. Watson.
The Ghost of Banquo's Ghost. One of the lighter of my Vera Vance-like ghostly mysteries, and in fact one of the most challenging to read. There are 5 women's voices in this story. There's Lucille and Vera, there's the store manager's wife, there's Mary, the seamstress, and there's Josephine LaFrance, the actress. Before anyone leaves any negative comments anywhere, I want to point out that I'm not trying to sound like a woman. That's just beyond my capabilities. What I'm trying to do is differentiate the voices from one another. Now, this story makes very clear references to Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson and the parallels between that very famous duo and Vera and Lucille. This is something that I play around with throughout the Vera Vance-like ghostly mystery series. In fact, the most recent novel, not the very last novel, but the most recent novel, is titled The Hound of the Seven Mounds. I play around with Arthur Conan Doyle's The Hound of the Baskervilles. I also play around with Nathaniel Hawthorne's The House of the Seven Gables, which there are some striking and curious parallels between those 2 earlier novels. There's an important portrait of an ancestor. There's an alleged family curse. There's a tragic brother. There's a plot to get the family wealth. I played around with all of those things and sort of spun them on their head in The Hound of the Seven Mounds. But this story, The Ghost of Banquo's Ghost, comes from what's called a composite novel. The title is Help for the Haunted, and it has 13 separate investigations. They take place over the course of a decade, but there's some interweaving between them. Something that comes up in an early story, I return to that again in a later story. So if you do go ahead and buy Help for the Haunted, I strongly recommend you read it in order. If you would like to learn more about any or all of these novels, please visit brownbonesbooks.com. If you go to the separate pages for the separate novels, you'll also find a section called The History Behind the Haunting. And there you'll learn some authentic history that's lurking behind the mysteries. You can also read some of the reviews that I've gotten. In fact, if you go to Amazon and look up Help for the Haunted, a decade of Vera Vance-like ghostly mysteries, you'll find over 20 very positive reviews. I'm very, very proud. I pat myself on the back. But who am I? To tell you the truth, after reading this story, I have no idea.
I have no idea. I have no idea. I have no idea who I am anymore.
Yes, I do. I'm Tim Prossel, I believe, and thanks for listening.